December 16th, 1944. Deep within the frozen Ardennes forest, SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper gazes across a line of steel monsters, his tigers and panthers, the pride of the Panzer, as they tear open the American defenses. For the first few hours, it almost seems as if the Führer's desperate gamble might succeed. Peiper's elite Kampfgruppe, the razor edge of Hitler's final great offensive, spreads confusion and fire through the enemy ranks. But Peiper's eyes are not fixed on the foe. They're fixed on the gauges inside his tanks. Every jolt forward drains precious drops of gasoline, the lifeblood that separates triumph from mechanical death in the snow. The entire operation, Germany's last hope, rests on audacity, surprise, and faith. A prayer for fuel. They were told the enemy's own supplies would feed their advance. The Führer's orders were clear. The soft, comfort-dulled Americans would abandon their stockpiles in panic, leaving behind a bounty of fuel. And, deep in the Belgian woods, Peiper's men would indeed stumble upon what seemed like a miracle. A vast American fuel depot. For a moment, it felt like divine intervention. But miracles, they soon learned, can lie. That discovery would not bring salvation, but a cold realization. A mathematical proof that their cause was doomed, and that American industry, not German courage, would decide the fate of the war. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was suffocating. In the east, the Red Army was an unstoppable tide, grinding ever closer to Berlin. In the west, the Allies stood poised on Germany's very doorstep. For the High Command, it was catastrophe. But in Hitler's mind, it was inspiration, the stage for one final masterpiece of destruction. The plan was audacious, bordering on madness. Operation Watch on the Rhine. 3 German armies, led by the last remnants of his once mighty Panzer divisions, would smash through what he believed to be a weak sector of the American line in the Ardennes. They would cross the Meuse River, cut the Allied armies in half, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Its capture meant everything. Hitler didn't just think it would choke off the Allies' supplies. He promised his generals that Antwerp's fuel stores would rearm his starving armies. But this dependence on captured resources wasn't just a feature of the plan. It was the plan. Germany's fuel starvation. By late 1944, Germany's fuel crisis had reached catastrophic levels. Allied bombers had relentlessly targeted synthetic fuel plants, reducing production by nearly 90%. The oil fields of Ploiești, once the Reich's main source of crude, were now in Soviet hands. The consequences were everywhere. The Luftwaffe, once a terror of the skies, was grounded. Its jet fighters sat idle, their tanks dry. Civilian traffic had nearly vanished, and the Gestapo hunted black-market fuel traders like traitors. The numbers told the story of defeat. In 1944, Germany's entire war economy produced just over 33 million barrels of oil. That same year, the United States produced more than 1.8 billion. A single oil field in East Texas outproduced all of Nazi-occupied Europe combined. While American refineries were busy finding ways to dispose of excess fuel by experimenting with new byproducts, German quartermasters were forced to decide which tanks could move, and which must be left to rot. Hitler's generals estimated they only had enough fuel for a third of the advance toward Antwerp. The rest, they were assured, would come from the enemy. It was a roll of the dice, played with the future of an empire. The Iron Beasts and their hunger. The core of the offensive was the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich, with Peiper leading its spearhead. Peiper's men were the embodiment of the Nazi myth, hardened, ruthless, and armed with the most feared machines of the war. Their tigers and panthers were masterpieces of engineering, and gluttons for fuel. The Tiger II, with its thick sloped armor and devastating 88mm cannon, was almost untouchable from the front. The Panther, perhaps the best all-around tank of the war, combined agility with deadly precision. But both shared one fatal flaw: an insatiable thirst. Peiper knew each Tiger II devoured roughly 2.5 gallons of gasoline per mile. In the icy, hilly terrain of the Ardennes, that number could easily double. For every gallon burned by an American Sherman, a Tiger might consume 3. For a nation out of fuel, fielding such beasts was insanity. It was a product of a flawed belief that superior quality could always overcome quantity. But a tank that cannot move is not a weapon. It's a tomb. Keeping the armored columns rolling became a logistical nightmare. Each Panzer division was a chaotic mix of vehicles, each with different engines, parts, and fuel types. Countless trucks were needed to keep them supplied, and every truck was a prime target for Allied fighter bombers. The dreaded Jabos that ruled the E. The dreaded Jabos that ruled the skies. By December 1944, German logistics were in free fall. Fuel was siphoned from wrecks. Captured American jeeps were drained dry within minutes. Peiper might command 100 tanks, but if only 30 had enough fuel to move, his strength was a shadow on paper. The German plan demanded that these armored predators live off the land, to feed on the arteries of the enemy's supply lines. They were hunters unleashed into a frozen wilderness, expected to survive on whatever they could seize. Meanwhile, the United States fought a global war running on a river of oil. For the average American soldier, fuel wasn't a luxury. It was as certain as the air he breathed. The Red Ball Express, a machine that never slept. The massive system that made this possible was one of the Allies' greatest achievements. The Red Ball Express. When the advancing armies outpaced their supply lines, the Allies created a 24-hour convoy route. Trucks in constant motion on roads closed to all other traffic. At its height, nearly 6,000 trucks, mostly GMC Jimmies, driven largely by African-American soldiers, became the arteries of the Allied advance. In just 82 days, they hauled over 400,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself was so vast that it consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day, simply to keep itself running. A German commander would have wept at such abundance. On the morning of December 16th, the forest of the Ardennes erupted with thunder. The German offensive achieved total surprise. Through the gaps in the disoriented American lines poured the men and machines of Kampfgruppe Peiper, an armored spear driving deep into Belgium, racing not only against the enemy, but against their own fuel tanks. Then, near the small village of Honsfeld, they struck gold. What they found was the kind of miracle soldiers dream of. A captured American rest stop turned into a supply depot, stacked high with fuel and munitions. For the fuel-starved Germans, it was a paradise of steel and abundance. After months of scraping together every foul drop of ersatz fuel, Peiper's men found themselves surrounded by mountains of gleaming American jerry cans. A German officer later described it as a forest made of gasoline. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and snow, but now carried the intoxicating fumes of high-grade 80-octane fuel, pure, clean, and powerful. For a moment, it seemed as if fate itself had intervened. The initial reports glowed with excitement. 50,000 gallons captured, enough to refuel Peiper's entire column and power a mad dash toward the Meuse River. The men celebrated. After years of deprivation, this felt like divine reward, proof that discipline and resolve could still conquer indulgence. They mocked the careless Americans for leaving behind such riches. Hope, rarer than fuel, surged through the ranks. In that frozen moment, it felt as though Hitler's gamble might actually pay off. But euphoria gave way to unease. The realization. As officers catalogued their miraculous find, an unsettling truth began to surface. Among the stacks of crates and ammunition, they discovered discarded American newspapers and shipping manifests. At first, these seemed trivial, but as logistics officers studied the papers, their joy turned to dread. The documents were dated only weeks earlier. The manifests revealed something incredible. The fuel in those jerry cans had been refined in Texas, shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded in France, and transported to this very location in less than 6 weeks. This was not some forgotten depot. This was just one droplet in a flowing ocean of supply, a small, replaceable link in an unstoppable chain. Then came the true blow, reports about the Allied pipeline system. The Germans learned that beneath the earth ran a network of flexible pipelines, pumping a steady, endless stream of fuel directly from the British coast to the advancing front lines. One of these lines alone could deliver 300,000 gallons per day, enough to keep an entire German Panzer division running for a month. It was an unthinkable scale. That single captured dump, the so-called jackpot, suddenly felt pitiful. 50,000 gallons was not a treasure. It was pocket change. The Americans hadn't lost anything of value. To them, this was the equivalent of a millionaire dropping a coin and not bothering to pick it up. The Germans stood silent, surrounded by the wealth of an enemy who could afford waste. A nation of endless fuel. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as decadent, soft, incapable of real war. But here, in the heart of the Ardennes, that illusion crumbled. A German soldier later wrote, "There was a kind of awe and despair in realizing that our greatest prize was something they would barely notice losing." This was more than a tactical revelation. It was psychological collapse. The soldiers realized, perhaps for the first time, that their fight was no longer against men, but against an industrial god. The American army was a machine that ran on oil, limitless, tireless, and self-renewing. Every drop the Germans captured was instantly replaced by 1,000 more flowing through invisible arteries beneath the soil. The fuel dump, once a beacon of salvation, became a symbol of futility. The Germans had found not victory, but a mirror, one that showed just how hopelessly outmatched they were. The power of production. The deeper revelation went beyond fuel. It exposed a truth about modern war itself. The Allies didn't simply outfight the Axis, they outproduced them. In 1944, the United States produced 50 times more oil than Germany. While the Reich rationed every drop, American refineries were flooded with surplus. Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, connected England to France through undersea hoses, pumping millions of gallons of fuel across the channel. From there, smaller pipes branched out like veins through liberated Europe, following the advancing armies. At its peak, the Allied forces in northwestern Europe burned through 7.5 million gallons a day. The U.S. First Army alone maintained a reserve of 3.5 million gallons, ready for immediate use. To the Germans, such figures were beyond comprehension. They had built their war machine on faith in human will. The Allies had built theirs on an ocean of industry. While Peiper's tanks crept forward on fumes, American convoys thundered ahead without pause, their fuel supplies as vast as their confidence. The collapse of the dream. The truth hit the Germans like ice. Their entire offensive, every order, every hope, depended on an illusion. They were supposed to seize enough from the enemy to survive, but the enemy's abundance was so vast that their theft was meaningless. That fuel depot didn't represent salvation. It represented defeat. When Peiper's officers understood the logistics behind the American war machine, something shifted in their hearts. Their faith in Hitler, in destiny, in German engineering, cracked. They realized that even if they captured 10 more depots, it wouldn't matter. They were fighting an enemy who could burn what they needed most and never feel the loss. That night, as the flames from the captured fuel lit up the snow, the men stared into the fire in silence. What had once felt like triumph now felt like a cruel joke. They had found the enemy's heart and discovered it could not be starved. The end of the Iron Spear. By December 23rd, the illusion of momentum was gone. The roads that had once echoed with the roar of Peiper's Tigers now lay silent, littered with burned-out wrecks and frozen bodies. The Great Offensive, Hitler's final throw of the dice, was grinding to a halt. All around Peiper, the forests of the Ardennes had turned into a maze of snow and smoke. American artillery rained down with mechanical precision, cutting every escape route, severing every supply line. The promised fuel never came. The last drops in their tanks were measured like holy water. Trucks and half-tracks stood immobilized, their engines long since dead. Soldiers tried to drain fuel from wrecks, siphoning what little remained through rags into tin cups. Men pushed tanks by hand, desperate to keep the illusion of movement alive. But machines that once symbolized unstoppable might were now rusted statues, monuments to a faith in steel that could no longer move. Peiper gathered his officers in a half-ruined farmhouse near the village of La Glaise. Maps lay scattered across a wooden table, their bright arrows now meaningless. Outside, the muffled thud of distant guns marked the shrinking of the world. One of his lieutenants whispered what no one dared to say aloud. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, we are out of fuel." Peiper didn't respond immediately. He simply looked out through the shattered window, watching the flakes of snow drift across the blackened hulks of his tanks. Each flake landed softly on iron that would never move again. The death of the spearhead. With his column encircled, Peiper made the only decision left. He ordered the destruction of everything that could not move. Vehicles, guns, ammunition, even the precious fuel they had fought so hard to capture. Flames rose into the frozen night, turning the snow crimson. The fire burned for hours. Panthers, Tigers, and half-tracks, the finest weapons of a dying empire, cracked and twisted in the heat. The men stood in silence, their faces glowing orange from the reflection. Some wept openly. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, at the machines that had once made them feel invincible. When the order came to abandon the vehicles, they left behind not just metal, but belief. The tanks that had once been symbols of German superiority were now nothing but pyres of smoke. As dawn broke, Peiper led the survivors on foot through the woods. Their boots crunched through the snow, each step echoing the retreat of a nation. They carried only their rifles and what little hope remained. By the time they reached German lines, less than a quarter of Peiper's original force remained. The vanishing of the dream. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation, a final, undeniable truth about modern war. Courage and discipline could not replace fuel. Tactics could not substitute for logistics. Germany had built its empire on the myth of willpower, that sheer determination could overcome any shortage, any enemy. But the Ardennes shattered that illusion. No matter how fierce the soldiers, no matter how advanced the weapons, an army without gasoline could not move, could not fight, could not live. The industrial war that Hitler had tried to wage demanded not just bravery, but resources beyond imagination. When Peiper's last tanks burned in the snow, they marked the death of that illusion. The moment when the mechanical heart of the Third Reich finally stopped beating. The Empire of Abundance. While Peiper's men trudged through the ruins of their dream, the American advance rolled forward, slow, relentless, and fueled by an empire of oil. Behind every Sherman tank came an unbroken chain of trucks, pipelines, and tankers. Each gallon burned was instantly replaced by another. Each destroyed convoy was just a ripple in an endless sea. In the months that followed, Allied forces crossed the Rhine, surrounded the Reich, and burned what remained of Hitler's armies to ash. In Berlin, as Soviet shells fell, the war that had begun with lightning and steel ended with silence and exhaustion. The United States, by then, had become the beating heart of the modern age, the world's first true petro-superpower. Its economy and military ran on a scale that no other nation could match. Fuel had won the war. The lesson of the Ardennes historians would later write that the Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last gasp. But for those who lived it, it was more than that. It was a prophecy of the future, a warning carved in snow and oil. Modern war is not won by glory, but by logistics. Not by the sharpness of the sword, but by the endless hum of engines that never stop. Peiper's men learned that truth too late. They fought bravely, even heroically. But bravery could not fill an empty tank. In the end, it was not the Allies' strategy or numbers that broke them. It was the quiet, invisible power of production. The rhythm of refineries, the endless flow of invisible power of production. The rhythm of refineries, the endless flow of pipelines, the mechanical pulse of a nation that could feed its machines forever. Epilogue: the snow and the silence. When the snow melted in the spring of 1945, the forests of the Ardennes revealed their secrets. Burned tanks, twisted guns, and rusted barrels lay scattered like bones. In the ashes of La Glaise, the remains of Peiper's column stood frozen in place, a monument to the end of an era. Today, the villagers still tell stories of that winter, of the thunder that came from the east, of the fire that turned night into day, and of the black smoke that hung over the valleys for weeks. Among those relics, one rusted Tiger II still stands, its gun pointed toward the west. It never moved again after that night. Its fuel tank ran dry, and with it, so did the dreams of a nation that believed steel could conquer the world. The lesson remains simple, eternal, and unchanging. In war, power is measured not only in courage, but in the fuel that keeps courage alive. And in the winter of 1944, deep within the snow-covered Ardennes, that fuel finally ran out.